Hi guys! Thought I'd take a couple of minutes to help you out answering our unit essential question and get you on the right road for success on your project. So remember, our unit essential question is, how did Britain's new colonial policy lead North Carolinians and the colonists towards the Revolutionary War? Well, first, let me start by saying that Britain's new colonial policy was to put troops in the colonies after the French and Indian War. And here's why they did it. Remember, after the war, that Britain had won, the Native Americans were pretty upset about it, and the colonists wanted to continue pushing westward. So King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, which drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And his intention was to keep the Native Americans to the west and the colonists to the east, and to keep them from fighting. The problem was that the colonists were not going to be stopped. They wanted the land, they needed the land, and some of them were already out there. So it was going to not be very effective. So he sent some troops over to the colonies. He already had war debt from the French and Indian War to pay off, and now he had to pay additional troops to be there to keep the peace. So he needed to do something to raise money. So he enacted the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. First, the Sugar Act was upsetting to the colonists because of the triangle trade. Remember that the colonists grew the raw sugar, sent it back to Britain. They turned it into sugar and rum, and that rum went down to Africa and was traded for slaves, and the slaves came back over to the colonies to be used for laborers to grow things like sugar and cotton, tobacco. And the cycle continued. So that was upsetting to them, but it wasn't enough to pay off those soldiers, so he also enacted the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act put a tax on things like newspapers, playing cards, and legal documents. Well, the colonists decided to get together to do something about it, so they came together at the Stamp Act Congress 1765 and wrote to the king and asked him to please repeal their taxes. This is when we start to hear the idea of taxation without representation. The colonists didn't necessarily disagree with the taxes, but they just wanted to have a voice in how the taxes were going to be raised. So he actually gives in to the colonists and repeals the Stamp Act, but comes out with a declaratory act, which says, I just want to remind you that I'm the king, and what I say goes, and you're not getting a voice in my parliament. That's the end of that. Well, the king also realized that the colonists were getting a little too powerful for his liking, and so he sent some of his own men over to the colonies to keep an eye on things, keep things moving smoothly, and they needed to be paid. So he enacted the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts taxed imports. Why this was so upsetting to the colonists is because the colonists were growing raw materials and sending them back to Britain. They weren't manufacturing things, so they relied on imports from England for things like textiles, shoes. Remember, we talked about this in class. And adding taxes to that just made the price of everything go up. So they weren't too thrilled with the Townshend Act. Well, we have a couple things that happen in reaction to these taxes and the troops. The first is the Boston Massacre. In 1770, a group of Boston citizens were coming out of a tavern late at night, a little bit rowdy. They got into a skirmish with some British troops. Shots were fired, and 5 people were killed. 5 Bostonians were killed. And Paul Revere, who was a patriot, used the opportunity to gain support for the Sons of Liberty and their cause by depicting it in a very, very, making the British troops seem really, really violent towards the colonists, and he named it the Bloody Massacre. And colonists all over the 13 colonies were outraged by it. Well, that's just the first of many things to come. And we now get to the Boston Tea Party, which occurs when a shipment of tea coming from the East India Company, who did not have to pay taxes on the shipment of tea themselves, brought tea to Boston Harbor, and the colonists were going to have to pay the tax on the tea because of the Townshend Acts. Well, they were so outraged by it that the Sons of Liberty decided to do something about it. So they dressed up like Native Americans, snuck onto the ship, and then dumped the tea into the harbor. Well, the king in return was so outraged that he passed the Intolerable Acts, which shut down the port of Boston and made it so that nobody in Boston could import or export anything, and it crippled the economy. It also served to really outrage the rest of the colonies because they're starting to see the king as a tyrant. So in 1774, the colonists got together in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress, and they wrote the king a list of their grievances. And they gave it a year to let him straighten things out to their liking, and if not, they were going to reconvene in 1775. And that is where we stopped, and I skipped over a couple things, but you can look back to your notes and, at the Regulator Movement and the Edmonton Tea Party. All those things you can be woven into a very good essay to answer that UEQ. I hope this was helpful. Keep checking on Edmodo because I'm going to keep posting these little flip cam videos. And I will see you in class. Tomorrow we will start talking about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Have a great night.